Yeah, a very warm welcome from my side as well, and it's great to have you all here, especially our guests who traveled far to be here with us. It's really an honor. And I just want to say a couple of words on how this idea of this working was born. So for a while, there's been a renewed interest in Marxist and critical thinking, which needs to be understood in the context of the most recent neoliberal iteration of capitalism and the way in which it disposes racialized and feminized bodies to premature death, as we've seen in the global pandemic. So we've seen both in public discourse, but also academic writing, that there is this renewed interest in Marxism, but that this cannot be simply a return to Marx, because obviously capitalism has taken on new forms and shapes in the 21st century with climate change, the pandemic, global patterns of migration, the way global production has been outsourced to the global south, mass incarceration. So this is one side is changing phase of capitalism. And then there's an incredible richness of queer and intersectional thinking. So Marxism has to be rethought both in light of the changing contours of capitalism, but also in light of all the new insights we have in queer, feminist, and decolonial and intersectional theory. And this requires new forms of thinking that, on the one hand, revive the incredibly rich apparatus of Marxism that we have, and brings all these new insights of these theories that have been developed over the past decades together. And this is why it's very exciting that we have some of the most interesting thinkers of these new currents with us here today. So it's really great that you're here and sharing your papers in advance. And reading them, it really struck me how they all sort of think through with and against Marx, how they flesh out and bring to life his conceptual apparatus, but really trying to think of class, race, and gender all as part of a capitalist totality. And as Tomke mentioned, our research group focuses on the bodily experience of gendered and sexed bodies. And to really understand bodily experience, we have to understand how they are embedded in economic and social processes and how they are experienced. So this really coincides with, as I said, this broader mainstreaming of a critique of capitalism that goes beyond a neoliberal iteration of capitalism that strikes much more fundamentally at the heart of capitalist relations. And we wanted to take this as a starting point and see how our own research speaks to these broader developments and use it as a fruitful beginning for our discussions. Because capitalism, of course, has on the one hand intensified its exploitation of racialized, gendered, and queer bodies, but also found ways of co-opting and including them. So there is a space where we need a more specific understanding of how capitalism operates and how all these forms of exploitation are intermingled with affect, bodies, and experience. So yes, we hope this is only the beginning of a continued dialogue in this format and to make all this important theoretical work that you've done more visible in the academy and beyond. So that's really exciting. Thank you so much.
So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Ashley Bohrer. Dr. Ashley Bohrer is an activist scholar based in Chicago. She's an assistant professor of gender and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame, and previously held a postdoctoral position at Hamilton College. She holds a PhD in philosophy from DePaul University, and her research in the field of philosophy, critical race theory, decolonial theory, intersectional feminism, and Marxism explore the intersection of capitalism, colonialism, racism, and heterosexism. Along with Justin De Leon, she co-hosts the Pedagogies for Peace podcast, and she currently serves as a public philosophy editor for the blog American Philosopher Association. In addition to her academic work, Ashley devotes most of her time in social movement and for intersectional and anti-capitalist liberation. And I just wanted to end this brief introduction by thanking you for accepting our invitation, and I'm very happy that you are here with us. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So first, I want to start with a series of thank yous to Vanessa, to Edith, to Annika for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm also a bit jet lagged, so if it takes me a minute, I might ask you to repeat your questions. But thank you so much for the invitation. And especially for the often underappreciated and invisibilized labor that it takes to pull off an event like this. It takes a lot to sort of create and cultivate these spaces of cross-pollination and collective possibility, and I'm very grateful to all of you for doing that. thank you all for spending your morning with me also, those of you who showed up in person or who are on Zoom. Second, a little bit of a preface. So what I'm presenting today is from a new book project, which I am at the very, very beginning stages of writing. So what I'm about to say is provisional, and I thank you all for being in dialogue with me as I'm developing this work. But this means that there are inevitably sort of oversights or sloppiness in thought or in language. So I really genuinely invite feedback. As I said, I'm also jet lagged, so that might also contribute. I'm going to focus a little bit on the overarching theory or the speculative part of the project today, rather than on any of the empirical or historical cases that, as Lisa Vogel argues, sort of puts flesh on the bare bones of theory. I'm more than happy to try to do some more of that fleshing out in the Q&A or to show some of the receipts for the claims that I'll be making more speculatively in the talk itself. All right. Finally, here we go, a theory. In general, when one speaks about capitalism, one often speaks about mobility, exchanges, cycles, circulation. In short, one speaks frequently about movement. In Capital, Marx writes, quote, "The valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless," end quote. In that work, capital is described as a boundless drive and a passionate chase, among other signifiers of constant movement. In a variety of other historical and contemporary accounts, movement is the central unifying thread in how we think about capitalism. Whether speaking about globalized money flows, economically motivated migration, outsourcing, international trade, or digital currency, contemporary capitalism seems, above all, to be a system uniquely invested in the movement of people, goods, and money around the globe. In contemporary Marxist accounts of capitalism, the emphasis on movement is clear. David Harvey argues that, above all, capitalism is a system of flow. Deleuze once referred to capitalism as the monary flux. Badiou calls it a boundless quest, and we could go on and on with these kind of contemporary accounts. And looking around the contemporary world, it seems hard to deny that capitalism has produced movement on a previously unprecedented scale. The fact that I, the child of New York Jews who grew up in Los Angeles, lives now in Chicago, I'm sitting in the room in Bielefeld today talking with you, right, is sort of only the most superficial anecdote that confirms what the macro data tells us, which is that globalized capital has produced the most mobile workforce in the history of the world. That I am reading this talk from an Apple device whose parts were manufactured in China, assembled in Austin, Texas, and made from component pieces that span the globe, semiconductors from the UK, tungsten from the Democratic Republic of Congo, glass from Japan, diodes from Germany. It's just further evidence that we are now living through a completely unprecedented movement of goods and people across all facets of the globe. In fact, despite what even critics have to say about the horrors of capitalist accumulation, it is common sense Marxist historiography to claim that the transition from feudalism to capitalism essentially consisted in freeing the labor and bodies of the unserved class, allowing for freedom of movement unprecedented in at least European history, even if that freedom came with severe exploitation. So that's a setup. But capitalism is also a system predicated on contradictions. And thus it should come as no surprise that capitalism is also grounded in confinement, captivity, and restraint. And even so, even in this case, for example, of the new freedom of movement that came with capitalism's triumph over feudalism, this process was rooted in the enclosure of common land into private property, permanently separating workers from their means of direct subsistence. So even in this very particular case, the historical condition for the possibility of movement under capitalism is a form of confinement in the form of the enclosure hedge, drawing a border between the people and the land from which they drew their water, collected wood, gathered edible and medicinal plants, the land on which they grazed their domesticated animals and hunted wild ones. In short, the new movement of former peasants was a response to a form of confinement that made life impossible. My provocation here is that the imbrication of movement and confinement under capitalism is not unique to this one example of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe, but it is rather a central piece of the way capitalism unfolds, spreads, and reproduces itself across the globe. That is, if we looked hard enough at any of the flows, circulations, or seemingly ceaseless movements of goods, people, and ideas under capitalism, we will find underneath it various modes of confinement as its condition of possibility. Consider for a moment some of the watershed moments of confinement we see in the history of capitalism. Beyond enclosures, capitalism continued to invent ever new strategies for confining the global working class. Workhouses and poorhouses mushroomed in the 16th century to manage newly impoverished workers, especially women and children. This phenomenon was so widespread during the time of capitalism's initial rise that Jan Mullier-Boutin refers to it as the Great Fixation. Federici notes quite famously that European women kind of move into this new space of domestic confinement so that their labor can be used for capitalist accumulation but remain unpaid. At the same time as this sort of transformation of confinement in Europe, European powers ushered in the world historical creation of race in the modern sense through its use of confinement strategies of colonial capitalism in Middle Passage ships, mines, and large-scale plantations to appropriate the labor and land of African and Amerindian peoples for the benefit of Europe. After the end of de jure slavery, tactics of redlining, segregation, the creation of slums, all constituted mechanisms of both control and accumulation of racialized capitalism. Throughout capitalism's history, then, confinement has been used as a consistent tactic of accumulation, one shot through with the raced, gendered, and classed components that an intersectional analysis of capitalism locates as crucial. What I'm interested in is exploring the possibilities for generating a more theoretical analysis of how and why confinement becomes such a constant and concerted strategy of capitalism. But moreover, what interests me in the strategy of confinement is its incredibly differentiated nature. While many groups, the poor, the mad, the feminized, the racialized, the vagrant, the rebellious, the criminal, have all been variously subjected to modes of confinement, their confinements are themselves and were quite radically different. The domestic confinement, for example, of European women can in no way be reduced or compared with the racialized violence of the Middle Passage, and indeed charting this sort of consistency of confinement in no way suggests their equivalence. These institutions and structures, rather, are precisely important or precisely fulfilled their function for capital on the basis of their differences, right? The differences are the thing that they are intended to produce. In short, I propose to explore at one and the same time the commonality of a capitalist strategy of confinement through a differential analysis of the multiple logics of confinement produced over the history of capitalism. The simultaneous consistency and variety of modes of confinement across capitalism's development, I think, suggest its structural centrality. So the fact that there's this simultaneous consistency and differentiation. As Patricia Hill Collins powerfully examines in her landmark Black feminist thought, despite differences across identity and circumstances, many tactics of oppression are continually redeployed as elements in what she calls the matrix of domination. The concept of the matrix of domination allows Collins simultaneously to mark differences between the constitution and effects and targeted population of a tactic, and to highlight the continuities, right? So in contrast to intersections, which Collins also talks about, like specifically in the 2002 edition, she wants to separate. So intersections are about specific places and social locations, right? They're the places where identity categories are interarticulated, whereas a matrix of domination rather is tracing sort of continuity of strategies of domination that can affect different intersections, if that distinction makes sense. So the fact that, for example, like segregation was used as a tool of domination in the Jim Crow US South and in apartheid South Africa, and continues to be used by Israeli forces against Palestinians, doesn't, like, we could mark that segregation as a strategy in the matrix of domination without erasing the differences between those situations, which would be the particular intersections, right? But there's something about the recurrence of the spatialized, racialized separation across contexts that can illuminate something powerful or helpful about how settler colonial capitalism works specifically. as just such an axis inside the matrix of domination that capitalism produces. While the specificities of particular instances of confinement may differ, and they may affect different groups of people with discontinuous histories, I think we learn something important about the constitution of capitalism by marking the frequent and recurrent deployment of confinement as one of its strategies of domination. So today I'm not going to get into any of the specific cases that I gestured toward quite quickly, like above. I'm happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. I want to focus today on exploring and explaining how I think confinement works under capitalism, and what refocusing our analysis of capitalism on confinement can help us think. So here's the next section. Reforms of confinement. My argument is that under capitalism, confinement occurs in primarily 3 interlocking and overlapping spheres. What I'm provisionally referring to, still playing with the language here, new project, but provisionally referring to here as the confinement of land, labor, and life. I want to be clear that any institution or practice of confinement, say slavery or colonization or private property, has resonances in all 3 spheres, and often all 3 need to work together in order to achieve their function under capitalism. I'm going to talk a little bit more today about what I mean by each of these terms, and comparatively little about how I think they work on each other, but again, I'm happy to explore that more in Q&A. So, confinement of land. So land, I think, makes the most intuitive sense potentially in terms of this argument. Capitalism across the globe proceeds through the physical enclosure of land and the erection of barriers around captured space. Enclosure is, of course, more than a simple demarcation. The enclosure of private property is fundamentally different than, say, a mere differentiation of function, right? We use this parcel of land for this planting and this parcel over here for composting or whatever. Not all private property is enclosed land, but enclosed land occupies a particularly important place in both the history and the logic of capitalist development. Okay, so what are some of the ways that the confinement of land operates under capitalism? I'm going to talk about a few. I think about this as illustrative rather than exhaustive. There's certainly more that I'm going to get to today, but perhaps the most often talked about, and I gestured toward this in the beginning of my talk, is the separation of workers from their means of subsistence. This is how Marx talks about it, especially in the last book of Capital. And it recurs in Marxist analyses of enclosure from the early modern period to the imposition of colonial rule to the sort of new enclosures of the 1990s and contemporary land grabs. Its most classic form is turning land that was previously held under a wide variety of communal land tenure systems into private property, concentrating control over the means of production, and perhaps more importantly, the means of subsistence, into the hands of a few owners. In this case, the previous uses of communally held land by the people becomes either totally inaccessible or accessible only for a fee. In either case, especially when the land has been used for access to the means of subsistence, by separating people from the land, this acts as a coercive measure to force people into reliance, either deeper or for the first time, on wage labor to buy either access to the land itself or to purchase items that had been previously freely provided directly by it. And so we can see here how like land, life, and labor begin to be totally intertwined. So one of the functions of the enclosure of land is as the background condition for coercing people into reliance on wage labor. We can also see that in a case where one cannot, for example, rent access to subsistence land, people are forced to turn to the commodities market in order to meet their basic needs. Whatever they had previously taken from the commons, they now have to purchase. And this is a central mode of incorporating people into markets, not just as sellers of their labor, but as purchasers of goods, right? So as dependent consumers. To create the practice and expectation of relying on the market. This aspect is what Ellen Mixon's Wood has called market dependency, which for her is the heart of what capitalism is. Anyone who's familiar with my book knows that I disagree with that as a definition of what capitalism is, but certainly market dependency has a particular function under capitalism for sure. From another angle, the enclosure of land is the condition for the possibility for selling the products of nature as commodities in the first place. So while the first two elements we just talked about, separation from the means of subsistence and market dependency, can occur if, say, the commons are enclosed as the privileged hunting ground for the ultra-rich, right? In many cases, the commons are enclosed in order to use the land specifically as means of production. And this can happen in a variety of ways, such as the appropriation of natural resources for sale, often for the sale of what had previously been free. So as Jason Moore has noted, paradoxically, capitalism often both gives a price to that which had been free, so making nature comparatively expensive, and it artificially constructs nature as one of the central chiefs for exploitation and surplus value accumulation. So it's like simultaneously nature becomes expensive and cheap at the same time. Culturally and religiously, the commodification of nature has its own series of implications, which in the book project I return to under the heading of the confinement of life. So what I've been speaking about so far is a confinement of land under individual private property in the European context. But equally central to the history of capitalist land enclosures, though rarely accorded equal importance in the literature, was the creation of capitalist private property in the process of colonization. So certainly colonial capitalism brought all of those elements that I just discussed, separation of colonized people from their means of subsistence, their coerced incorporation into market dependency, and the commodification of nature, sure. But colonial enclosures are and were central to capitalism in a variety of unique ways, including the fact that colonial land enclosures generated the very money that jump-started capitalist development in a historical sense. I've written about this extensively in other places. The short version of this argument is that the gold and silver bullion appropriated from the mines in the colonized Western Hemisphere, especially, though not exclusively, in Potosí and Guanajuato, was the basis of the physical money that jump-started capitalist development throughout Europe. And I'm very happy to talk more about this argument and the historical centrality of the price revolution in Q&A. But also Rosa Luxemburg argues in The Accumulation of Capital that capitalism structurally depends on non-capitalist spheres of development on which capitalism is fundamentally parasitic. As she argues, colonization and imperialism functionally allow for the direct theft of land and labor, but we'll talk about that in a minute, all while bypassing the market mediation of, having to pay for stuff. Really inconvenient. Even after the capitalist system has become deeply entrenched in nearly every other area of European economic and juridical life. And so in this sense, historically, part of the way that capitalism was able to spread and reproduce itself is because of the continuity of direct theft through colonial enclosure. Another way in which colonial enclosures differ constitutively from enclosures in Europe is the way that they brought exogenous rule, a new form of sovereignty, and indeed the imposition of a new order, including a new order of race in the modern sense. So when British landowners, for example, encircled the commons with hedges, the displaced peasants remained under the same form of juridical and social authority. It was a change, we might say, internal to a society. When British settlers, however, arrived at Jamestown, they brought with them British law, culture, and society. And when the Spanish, French, and Portuguese arrived, they brought the rule not only of crown, but of church. And so colonial enclosures, I think we can think about as this double displacement in a manner completely different from European enclosures, because they uniquely entail the subordination of colonized forms of life to a settler and colonial mode of life that was itself central to the rise and reproduction of capital. In this sense, in addition to thinking about the enclosure of land by and for property held individually, the process of enclosing land in a colonial context also entailed what I'm provisionally talking about as various collective enclosures in ways that were comparably exceedingly rare in Europe. So these colonial enclosures were the extension of a sort of nascent nation-state sovereignty system as well as imperial authority. And in the process of displacing indigenous peoples, often settlers formed their own sort of micro commons from which indigenous peoples were excluded. And in doing so, they replicated a system of communal landholding that was no longer possible in the settlers' countries of origin. In what might perhaps be the first instance of what Aiko Day has termed romantic anti-capitalism, settlers, many of whom risked disease, death, and despair of early modern migration precisely because they were on the receiving end of European enclosure, tried to revive a vision of pre-capitalist communal life but they did so through the racist dispossession of indigenous peoples from their lands. And so as Day argues, this romantic anti-capitalism sort of functions paradoxically as a way to stabilize capitalist accumulation through its own crises, rather than being an actual threat to it. I think we see this sort of development happening quite early in the colonial process. And so while the imposition of these direct settler commons designated for subsistence were somewhat short-lived, settler commons in the forms of like national parks and nature preserves continue to be central modes of colonial enclosures. And while it might seem counterintuitive to think of these spaces as central to capitalist development because they're often sort of fundamentally cut off from direct quantification, they frequently still prevent indigenous people from accessing traditional means of subsistence, as prohibitions on hunting, gathering, and other forms of land stewardship are often central ground rules of these spaces. We could further remark on the way that these spaces are often deeply embedded in lucrative leisure and tourism industries, including increasingly eco and agro-tourism, which not only function as sites of capital accumulation in their own right, but also as spaces for some workers to renew and refresh so they can return to their lives of surplus value extraction after the long weekend. That the establishment, maintenance, and expansion of such spaces also allows government entities to seem green, thereby relieving pressure on the capital ecological destruction relationship is also something that I think we could pull up further. More than all of this, however, colonial enclosures were the very condition of the possibility of an entire apparatus of colonial and especially settler colonial society, which buttressed colonial capitalism in myriad world-altering ways. What I'm trying to get at in all of these moments is that to think about colonial enclosures as just another imposition of capitalism, I think significantly misses the structural and historical specificity and necessity that they hold. Without colonial enclosures specifically, in other words, capitalism may well have remained a strange and somewhat contained economic practice of a relatively peripheral set of societies in the far north, rather than the world system we see today. All right, so the confinement of labor. Captured labor, I think, has perhaps been the most varied in terms of forms of confinement throughout capitalist history. We could talk about workhouses, impressment into colonial navies, alongside other forms of conscription, the use of penal labor, enslavement, encomiendas de servicio, entrapment into mines, forced labor in various forms of tribute, etc. So despite the fact that capitalism thinks of itself as being specifically about waged labor, and honestly, I think that anti-capitalist critics have too often taken sort of capitalist ideology at its own word about this, right? Then why do we see such a proliferation of forms of confined labor alongside the rise of capitalism? So one of the reasons I think that we see this is that it's very fundamentally, right, a way that capital can bypass having to pay for labor, sometimes on a temporary basis, sometimes permanently. In this sense, and I can't emphasize this enough, like capitalism is very specifically not always about waged labor, but is often about a relationship between waged and unwaged labor. Another function that the confinement of labor has is warehousing surplus populations and abusing their heightened vulnerability and marginality in order to get higher rates of surplus value extraction than would be possible for the general population. In the case of workhouses, which were common across the British Empire, confinement in them was a frequent punishment for modes of survival outside of the capitalist wage system, and this also had this kind of punitive sort of element as well. Most often deployed as a mode of punishment for beggars, vagrants, and sex workers, the particular punishment of confinement in a closed and compulsory institution of work had the effect of bringing labor that would otherwise have been considered a loss from the point of view of surplus value extraction into the quote-unquote productive economy. Disciplinary functions into the values and forms of life that capitalism sets out for the global working class is another use of this sort of confinement of labor. And this is one of the places that most clearly intersects with the sort of confinement of life element that I'll talk about next. But specifically, the confinement function of labor allowed the nascent global working class to be disciplined into the performance not only of capitalist labor, but also capitalist values. in ways that the so-called social reformers of the 17th and 19th centuries found absolutely central. The capitalist doesn't just like need us to go to work, but to want to work, to need to work, to believe that our work is our life, that our lives are only worthy if they're productive, like that we can be fulfilled, you know, if you're really doing the thing that you love, never work a day in your life, all of that bullshit, right? Like this is in a certain sense part of what the confinement of labor has always been interested in producing. Because that's a stabilizing mechanism for capitalism as well. In some circumstances, these like generalized social relations and ideology reproduce these ideas on their own, but where this doesn't exist or where this conditioning has failed to take hold, confinement is used thus as a disciplinary tool, disciplinary here in both its ordinary and I think also Foucauldian valences. The confinement of labor also quite directly attempts to prevent fugitivity. In cases even of the first set of serfs turned proletarians, there is widespread resistance to wage labor. Sucks. Attempts to flee the violent imposition of capitalist work was even more widespread in the cases of slavery, the corvée, the mita, the encomienda, and various other forms of labor. And so the confinement of the people forced into that labor was often deployed as a tactic in order to eliminate certain forms of resistance, right? And we can think about those forms of resistance in a really wide variety of ways, like the failure to show up, leaving to join another community, in the case of like Maroons, for example, and the various practices of marronage and palenques that came up all over the place. Sometimes the confinement of labor was also organized on a somewhat larger scale in the creation of like whole towns and complexes run by one's employer. And here we can think about, for example, the mill girls at the height of the industrial textile manufacturing, or the creation of so-called company towns across the world. We see a sort of particular function emerge when the site of labor directly takes hold of the other institutions of social life, of social reproduction outside of work. Sometimes this is about extorting profit at multiple points in the life process, assuring, for example, that workers pay back their wages to the company store or to the mill owner in the form of required dormitory housing costs, thus increasing the rate of accumulation over the same group of workers and edging out competition with other members of the local bourgeoisie, who ordinarily would take a share of the worker's wage through food, rent, etc. The confinement of labor was also central in the rise of colonial and especially settler colonial capitalism through penal transportation. At various points, convicted Europeans could exchange their life sentences in Europe for forced labor in the colonies, thus contributing to the settler expansion project of especially Spain, France, and Britain, who used this tactic the most often. The particular institution of penal transportation was central to the rise of settler colonial capital in two senses. First, it provided the actual physical necessary labor to build the colony, but also through that labor, expanding the settler sphere and extending the shape of colonial power. We should remember also that forced labor in colonial armies was a central practice, buttressing both colonial and settler colonial modes of accumulation and imposition. In some cases, young men were simply snatched off the streets and impressed into service in the armed forces, especially into colonial navies, which needed even more labor than could be secured by consent and contract. In other cases, the rise of mass colonization projects, especially in the 17th to 19th centuries, saw the institution of the first policies of mass conscription, which of course the rich and powerful could always avoid if they wanted. But the militaristic arm of colonial world-making was significantly achieved through forced labor. And in some cases, colonization brought the conscription of colonized people into the occupier army. And in this case, in addition to the direct capture of labor power, the function of this conscription can also be thought of as an attempt to manufacture allegiance and a subordinated, unequal incorporation into empire, sometimes with the explicit goal of preventing anti-colonial resistance. All right, we're getting there. Confinement of life. All right, so Marx very famously once wrote that there are two original sources of all wealth, and those are land and labor. I've already talked about those a bit, but I think there's another element that's at play here. In order to flourish and reproduce itself, capitalism also takes control of collective social life in a way that I think cannot be easily reduced directly to labor or land. certainly I think this is like one of the most helpful elements. I think that like feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial Marxisms have always insisted on that, like, you can't just reduce someone's experience of their gender, their sexuality, their racial social location to their position in relationship to land or to labor, right? So what I'm trying to get at here by talking about life is a sort of expanded sphere that encompasses social relations, but also the realm of experience. So certainly the accumulation of land and the exploitation of labor are central elements of capitalist extraction, but a materialist understanding of these processes unlocks the ways that capitalism structures social life outside of work and beyond land, influencing the character and the texture of life in a much broader sense than is captured by the twin pillars of land and labor. What some call elements of the capitalist superstructure, I think more accurately discussed under the headings of social relations, ideology, culture, and identity, are central to the ways that capitalism develops, reproduces itself, and maintains itself. While a sort of mechanistic and formalistic account of Marxism tends to subordinate these concerns, these vibrant traditions of feminism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and queer theory have also demonstrated how control over the forms and possibilities of life is not a byproduct of capitalist accumulation, but a central strategy of it. In general and overall, this work, my work here, is in part centered on how to once again place social relations in their multiple, divergent, contingent, and contradictory forms at the center of anti-capitalist theorizing. And so in this section of the project and the talk, what I'm calling the confinement of life is imbricated in, I think, two conceptual interventions. One is that the reminder that life is just essential to the functioning of capitalism as land and labor. I think if we only have these first two, land and labor, we have a balance sheet, not an analysis of society. And secondly, that specifically we need to understand these social relations and the differential possibilities of life under capitalism as organized through confinement. So just as capitalism depends on the confinement of labor and land, capitalism is, I think, a great innovator in the enclosure of life. As LeBaron and Roberts once described capitalism as reliant on the structural prevention of social mobility, what they call carcerality. That's not a full sentence. LeBaron and Roberts once described capitalism as reliant on the structural prevention of social mobility, what they call carcerality. There we go, that's a sentence. What they highlight in that piece is how debt, prisons, and the lack of social mobility are all ways that people become, quote, trapped in unequal and unfree hierarchical social relations, end quote. And so, of course, labor and land are central to the story of how these unfree social relations are created, organized, maintained, and reproduced over time. But the character of what it means to live under unfree and unequal social relations is not exhausted by them. Marxist critiques of capital, while I think they've been very good at giving accounts of land and labor, I think often stumble when we think about life. Far too often, discussions that relate to collective and self-understanding, group-based membership, identity, and ideas fall into a kind of brute functionalism that underplays both the severity and the extent of capitalism's control over all of our facets of life. And this functionalism, I think, founders to articulate the differential nature of life chances, opportunities, understandings, and aspirations beyond the workplace and beyond metrics easily described as economic. Moreover, inside a given capitalist society, there is no single organization of unfree and unequal social relations. But these, like relations to both land and labor, are differentially distributed, unequally felt, and divergently positioned. And so when I speak about the confinement of life, I'm interested in a pretty broad domain that includes at least a few things. In one sense, right, I'm interested in the way that there's a kind of repressive function that identity is mobilized toward under capitalism. And here I have to pause and be like, if you're not previously familiar with my work, please don't misunderstand me. I'm like a big stand for identity politics. I'm pro-identity politics. I wrote a whole book about why. But capitalism, I just want to make sure we're all together when I say that identity can be used and appropriated by capitalism for bad, nefarious ends. I don't mean, therefore, that all identity talk is bad, non-Marxist capitalist dreck, I don't know, right? But capitalism does make a repressive use of identity as a form of distributing life chances, responsibilities for social reproduction, in which it constrains, in which sort of what you are constrains who you can become and what you can do. And what I mean here is that race, gender, immigration status, sexuality, gender identity, ability, nationality, religion, parental language, etc., in all very different and overlapping ways, significantly determine under contemporary capitalism our access to resources, our access to institutions, our exposure to multiple kinds of overlapping violences, structural, institutional, bureaucratic, military, symbolic, police, interpersonal, discursive, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these sort of come together, patterns of access as well as patterns of exposure, to create a naturalized social anti-mobility that constrains the kind of life available to you. And that this is kind of from the outset, the basis is based on the outset from a series of imposed and ascribed identities, all of which we could track through the history of the rise of capitalism. And so for reasons that I talk about in the intersectionality book, we can think about the multiple ways that this is central to a capitalist society. I have a theory about it. In tandem with this, I think we find the social hegemony of what constitutes a life worth living in ways that justify and naturalize the unequal, uneven, and unfree patterns of access and exposure. And thus, in addition to enclosing the kind of life one is available to have and limiting the field of what it means for one's life to be socially valued, we also have to talk about the unequal distribution of death, both physical and social. In this sense, under capitalism, life itself sort of becomes a privilege, reserved only for a small segment of the population. Especially in this moment we are living in of climate catastrophe and vaccine apartheid, it is clearer perhaps than ever that capitalism functions by allowing some to live and exposing the vast majority of humans on the planet to death, disease, and destruction. Capital's enclosure of life thus works in and through the necropolitical policing of the boundaries between those who deserve life and those who can be constructed as disposable. It is thus both that capitalism polices the boundaries of who is able to live and controls and confines what kind of life is available to those who survive. I think we could also talk about, under this heading of the enclosure of life, the sort of enclosure of the imagination, of ideological position, right? Whether in the form of a sort of Thatcherite insistence that there is no society, or the constant echo chamber of there is no alternative apologism, the enclosure of ideological space and the narrowing of possibility is a central feature of capitalist strategy as one intended to disrupt forms of thinking about alternatives and the revolutionary impulse. Especially because the key insight of something like historical materialism is that human beings are the authors of the social system in which we find ourselves. This narrowing of ideological space also functions as a constraint on properly understanding the power of human action to reshape the collective structures we inhabit. In other words, part of the constraint that capitalism imposes on social life is the restricted understanding of human agency that functions to naturalize capitalism and discourage resistance. Okay, I think I've been talking for a long time, coming to the end of my time here, but I just want to conclude by saying that what I'm interested in is truly thinking is the following. If we embrace the call from the Communist Manifesto and hold that the working class has nothing to lose but its or our chains, then an anti-confinement politics has always animated revolutionary communist politics in a certain sense. And what I'm arguing here is that an analysis and reading of what those chains precisely mean and for whom, and how they might look and feel differently across space, time, and social location is crucial in the struggle for communism. That's it.